Our last speaker today is Kelly Elizabeth Shaw, who is assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. In 2009-10, she served as Fulbright IIE Scholar at the Department of History at Stockholm University, and her research interests include social policy, health policy, political sociology, immigration, and citizenship. Her book, The Rise and Fall of the Miraculous Welfare Machine, Nation, Immigration, and Social Democracy in 20th Century Sweden, was published just this last year by Cornell University Press. So this makes a second rising star. Thanks, Harley.
So, as these things often happen, the title of my talk has changed, but only very slightly since I submitted my abstract. It's now Racist Resurgences, How Neoliberal and Anti-Racist Lefts Make Space for the Far Right in Sweden and the United States. I want to thank the organizers, both for the fantastic symposium and also for their infinite wisdom in placing Ben and I right next to each other. Because Ben has done the fantastic work of laying out what the far rights are doing in these two cases, and I want to make the case that we can't really understand the far rights without also understanding the lefts. And so when I kind of elide the Sweden Democrats as a racist party, you have a much better, nuanced understanding of what's actually going on in the back of your head. And I want to also kind of start by giving an origin story to the paper, since Nicole asked Ben, where did this paper come from? It's kind of interesting to talk about where this paper came from, and I think to one degree, it's about a therapeutic experience of dealing with the Trump election, which I would guess is probably also true with Ben, right? But on the other hand, I've had for a long time this divide in my research and my teaching life where kind of one of my bread and butter courses that I've been teaching for the last 10 years is about race in America, while I've been writing about kind of immigration in Sweden on the other side. And while on the surface these seem like, they're parallel, right? Or they're not parallel, but they're intersecting. In practice, they're not really, right? We don't really use the research of on American race relations to understand what goes on in Europe, and we don't really use the research on European immigration, right, and ethnic difference to understand the United States. And I've had in the back of my mind to maybe think a little bit to try and use the concepts of American race sociology to understand Sweden better. And a little bit vice versa. I have a little bit of as several of you probably know from conversations in the breaks, a little bit of an evangelical mission to get Swedes to talk about race specifically. So maybe this is a part and parcel of that attempt. So in that vein, what the main question of the paper is, how do we make sense out of what I'm calling these kind of racist resurgences, right? The success of these far right parties in both cases that really trade on sometimes in subtle ways and sometimes in very blatant ways negative images of the ethnic other, and there has been a lot, well, not a lot, but there has certainly a stream of research that does what I think Ben is trying to do, which is trying to say, what are the similarities across these far-right parties? But there's been much less, I think, attention to what are the similarities on the other side, right, on the left side, that is also contributing to this. There's been some popular attention, right? So we've had some popular pieces written about kind of the neoliberal left, the kind of abandonment of economic inequality, particularly in the United States, as a factor, but not quite so much scholarly attention. And a lot of that scholarly attention has not been directed towards what I'm really interested in, which is, what are the racial effects of the neoliberal left? And so my goal is to kind of answer, the question, how do the blind spots of the neoliberal left, kind of broadly conceived, and with kind of different expressions in the US and Sweden, create space for the resurgence of far-right racism in both places? And to do so, I'm looking at two events that kind of disrupted politics as usual. This is really a political story, primarily as far as I'm concerned. The two events that disrupted politics as usual: the November election of Donald Trump, and actually the governmental crisis in Sweden in 2014. As a side note, as I'm thinking about what to do with this paper as I move forward, I'm going to expand this event in Sweden to include, kind of go up through the closing of the borders in 2015. I think we can kind of make a neat event that way, but I don't talk about that in this paper. And I'm not really trying to explain these events exactly, but rather I want to understand kind of the background conditions that made the events possible. And in so doing, I'm kind of drawing on a theoretical background around boundaries and borders. It's quite extensive in the sociological literature and around social closure. So you have people like Michel Lamont talking about the ways in which symbolic boundaries focused on ideas or imagined notions of belonging harden into social boundaries of exclusion. Or Jaworski, who discusses how both legal and what he calls moral boundaries of belonging are deployed strategically to define others as others and us as us. Right? And the finding here for both of this and kind of a broader range of literature is that there's an important link between material and imagined boundaries of membership, in that the meanings that become attached to material boundaries are heavily influenced by the moral and cultural boundaries that inform people's reading of the other. Right? In other words, to use Max Weber's term, social closure of a membership group is dependent on how in-group members perceive and utilize the ideas of boundaries. Sometimes there are mismatches between these two sets of boundaries that can't be reconciled or are difficult to reconcile. The legal or material boundaries and the symbolic and cultural don't line up. To use Peter's terms, the circles become more separate, right? And I, in the book that came out this summer, I call these kind of moments where these things don't line up and can't be reconciled, crises of closure. These are relatively short-lived, acute challenges to the agreed-upon boundaries of a membership group. They can occur in response to changes in conditions, so a large influx of refugees or an increased economic marginalization within a group, etc. They can be closures of entry, i.e. about who gets in, or crises of access to goods, both material and cultural goods. These types of closure, and therefore the crises that trouble these closures, often but not always occur simultaneously and are often deeply entwined. Both the election of Donald Trump and the Swedish governmental crisis of 2014 can be seen as kind of emblematic or touch points in a series of ongoing kind of crises of closures along lines of both entry and access to goods. Now these crises are also colored by ideological context. Ideology is deeply connected to notions of belonging, in some ways creating the rules for what's an acceptable dividing line in a society, and what mechanisms are available for inclusion, even maybe perhaps what it means to be included. Multiple and blended ideologies exist in most societies, and my book focuses mostly on the way that social democracy as an ideology creates certain legitimate lines for division and delegitimates other lines of division. But I'm going to focus here instead on neoliberalism, an ideology that is strong and ascendant in the US and has been for a while, and is rising in Sweden. Neoliberalism, of course, very kind of simplistically stated, is an ideology that favors the free market, It was initially intended to describe a very particular economic system, the capitalist system of the late 20th century, but the term has expanded over time to include a whole host of affiliated ideas, including ideas about freedom of choice in cultural contexts and the overwhelming importance of the individual as the causative and explanatory mechanism of much of social life. Whether these are integral to neoliberalism itself or an outgrowth of the economic ideology is up to debate. Now, applied to race, so what does neoliberalism have to do with race? We can kind of apply these ideas, this ideology of neoliberalism to the concept of race. What we get is kind of two things. One is that neoliberalism as an economic and cultural ideology is productive of a kind of colorblind racism, right? The idea that race is a meaningless construct and therefore racial inequality can be best solved by ignoring race, right? This is colorblind racism. Neoliberalism can also produce an approach to racism that focuses entirely on individual racist actions to the exclusion of the racial inequalities that are inherent in a system. And I think both of these connections between race and neoliberalism matter for the cases under study, though of course the American and Swedish versions of neoliberalism take different forms, partially because this is a more central and well-anchored ideology in the United States. Focusing on the neoliberalism of the left here, right? This is commonly thought of as a right ideology, but over time it has become central to many parts of the left as well. We kind of call this the Blairism, right? The Blairite Labor Party is often kind of the origin of the idea of neoliberal left, but increasingly left parties across Europe and the United States have become more neoliberal. And again, this is true in both the United States and in Sweden. In Sweden, the neoliberal left expression towards race looks like a shift towards a kind of racial individualism, particularly in the anti-racist movement left, whereas in the United States, the neoliberalism of the left is primarily reflected in a kind of free market ethos that pushes racial concerns out of focus. My argument here then is that both the Swedish and American left have contributed via somewhat different mechanism to a resolution of these crises of closure in favor of a racist far right set on kind of similar ideological backgrounds. So I'm going to go through each case. I'm going to start with the United States, the Democrats, and Donald Trump, and then I'll talk about Sweden. So, as we all know, in November 2016, Americans and I think most of the world were shocked by the largely unpredicted victory of presidential candidate Donald Trump. Trump had run, as you've heard from Ben, on a populist campaign colored by nationalist rhetoric, both economically nationalist and sort of racially nationalist, with sometimes subtle but often blatant racist tones. When the dust had settled on the election, many Americans on the left were perplexed as to how this could happen. The undertone to some of this conversation was a question, how could the American right have gotten so racist, right? But sometimes some commentators pause to consider, I think, a little bit of a different question, which was, how could the left have lost the very people that they were supposedly fighting for, right? The most vulnerable, the people who are most vulnerable to the damages of economic inequality. How did the Democrats who saw themselves as champions of this group, how did they lose that fight? The first question is, of course, an interesting one, and Ben has talked about it to a large extent, but I'm going to focus on the second one. And I think it's just as vital for understanding politics going forward. So to talk about the left, right, since Bill Clinton especially, the American establishment left has been pretty distinctly neoliberal, seeking market solutions to problems ranging from welfare to healthcare. Likewise, the Democratic Party has done very little to stem the bleeding of labor unions, or small-scale business, including family farms, since the rural vote is thought to be super important in this, although I would, you can talk to me afterwards, I would argue it's not nearly as important as some of the immediate reactions point to. But the abandonment of the social safety net, the decline in the tax rate, the de-investment in education, and the loss of small enterprise has meant suffering for most on the lower end of the income scale, including, importantly, whites. This came to a head in the 2008 economic crash. The Democrats held the presidency, but not Congress. That's important. But in any case, the Democrats had very few policy instruments that could have fixed the underlying inequality in the system. The economy recovered over time, but this recovery was not particularly well felt by poor whites in rural areas or in Rust Belt states. And it was downplayed by the conservative state-level politicians who essentially sounded alarm bells about insolvency, greedy public sector unions, and federal overreach. The neoliberal left had no language, really, to respond to this without unions, without strong economic policy levers at the state level, and with a recovery that did not do much to right 30 years of growing inequality. Poor whites felt, and rightly so, somewhat abandoned by the Democrats. At the same time, poor whites felt that others, African Americans especially, but people of color in general, were being included in the Democrats' vision of America. Whether or not that's true, right, that's a separate issue. But poor whites felt that African Americans were being included at the expense of them, right, at the expense of poor whites. This is via, a imaginary, generous welfare state, right, and other forms of special treatment on bases that were, according to this imaginary, unfair and unearned. Now, ironically, of course, people of color did not fare any better than whites during the Great Recession, and due to unequal distributions of wealth and racism in the housing industry in particular, were hit harder by the initial shock and recovered slower than poor whites. At the same time, very little race-specific support was offered by the Democrats themselves. In fact, in line with our expectations about neoliberalism in the left, the Democrats continue to offer primarily colorblind solutions to problems of racial inequality. Now, whites, poor whites in Republican areas, hearing the race-conscious rhetoric of a left that was outside of the mainstream, so things like Black Lives Matter, hooked race consciousness and race-specific remediations to the Democrats at the same time as these same outsider groups were lobbying accusations of colorblind racism at the establishment left, right? Neither group really feels included in this group. And this leaves the left, again, kind of without tools. Not only do they not have the tools to address economic inequality, but they definitely don't have the tools to address racial inequality. Colorblind ideology offers essentially only platitudes about the humanness of humanity for dealing with rhetoric like Trump's that paints Mexicans, Muslims, and African Americans as violent threats to America. There's an inadequate vocabulary for addressing kind of the complex system of institutional racism in which these groups and whites alike are embedded. The establishment left, then, has neither the policy tools to conquer economic inequality nor the conceptual tools to counter the explicit racism of Trump's far right. Thus, poor whites are excluded from the Democratic vision of America's social and moral boundaries via the Democrats' abandonment of them economically. The Republicans, on the other hand, offer white America a vision of Americanness that states that if only we could control our borders, right, both physically and socially, America could become great again. And the subtext goes, whites would recover their position of privilege in what they see as the natural order of American society. Under these conditions, attempts by the movement left, right, outside the mainstream of the establishment left, to seek inclusion of migrants and minorities in narratives about Americanness can be dismissed as mere identity politics, an attempt to make a claim for special treatment based on belonging in a non-white and sometimes non-male group. Whites, on the other hand, benefiting from the elision of whiteness with Americanness, such that if they as a group can be made successful again, America becomes great again, right, in Trump's narrative, regardless of the success or failure of Mexican, Muslim, or Black Americans. So that's case one. Case two is Sweden. And in Sweden, I think there's not been a single electoral moment analogous to Trump's victory, but we might see one soon in the future. But rather a kind of growing far right over the course of a few elections. Nonetheless, the far right in Sweden was behind a governmental crisis in early 2014 that was quite unusual in the Swedish context. The crisis occurred when, rather than abstaining from a vote on the ruling center-left bloc, so the red-green bloc, budget proposition, as is the norm for non-aligned parties in the Swedish system, the Sweden Democrats voted instead for the opposition's budget because SD had achieved phenomenal electoral success in the 2013 election. This essentially sunk the government's budget. This meant that the red-green bloc would have to govern under the opposition's budget, which they, of course, refused to do. Initially, a new election was called, something that is really unusual in the Swedish context. It's only happened once since full suffrage in Sweden. A last-minute kind of compromise prevented the new elections from being called, but the underlying problems of SD's refusal to allow to follow established political norms and intransigence on issues of immigration were not addressed by this compromise. Behind the crisis, this crisis was the refusal of SD to support a budget where, in particular, the Greens, who are supporters of as close to an open border policy as you can get, might have an influence on migration policy. SD thus promised to make the unrealized new election a referendum for or against increased immigration. They said that's what the new election would be. Right? Of course, they don't get the chance to do that because the new election never happens. SD, as you've heard, are an anti-immigrant party. Right? They're openly anti-immigrant party. They paint, although their image has changed over time, they paint migrants, who are nearly always in the sort of imaginary of SD Muslims, as uncivilized, as backwards, as savage, right? SD, like Trump in regards to Mexicans, depicts Muslim immigrants as criminals, potential terrorists, and especially as rapists. Muslims are depicted further as a cultural threat, as destructive of the Swedish way of life. Again, as Ben rightly points out, this is a cultural argument primarily. It's not necessarily an argument about the impurity of blood, right? They add to this a more mainstream critique of immigration that argues that there's a structural limit on the number of migrants that can be admitted, which seems like a sort of a reasonable argument to make, but it's unreasonable in the Swedish context, as Greta has pointed out. But they add to that, they do make that critique, and that the refugee acceptance system is overtaxed and administratively broken. Both of these ideas have popular support, but the cultural and crime argument is uniquely expressed by the SD, while the structural limitation argument has made appearances over time, or in various places over time. Like with Trump's election in the US, the success of SD in disrupting politics as usual left the Swedish left, and to a certain extent the Swedish right as well, asking where they had gone wrong, right? SD support came from many places, but especially from the young, the working class, and the unemployed. Like Trump voters, they on average were a little less educated than the general population. However, unlike Trump supporters, they were overwhelmingly low income. So one of the features that we see now that we have more information about who voted for Trump is that all of the rich white guys also voted for Trump, right? It's not just the story of poor whites. This is a little bit less true in SD. I mean, it's hard to make big generalizations, but like the Democrats, I think the left in Sweden sees themselves as the natural choice for this group of somewhat economically marginalized voters, though that natural support has eroded a great deal in the last couple decades. This leaves the red-green bloc asking many of the same questions as the American Democrats. How do they lose a part of their natural base to a party that's so virulent, so objectionable? In the US, the left equation for leaving space for Trump was colorblind economic neoliberalism plus a perceived empty identity politics. The left in Sweden, both the established red-green bloc and the anti-racist movement left, which I think it's good to distinguish those things, set the stage for the Sweden Democrats through an increasingly individualist conception of anti-racism that abandoned its prior focus on structural and political incorporation. Now, some of this looks similar to the mechanisms of the American left, right? The abandonment of strong social democracy for a softer Blairite neoliberalism by the Social Democrats, for instance. More important to this story, however, is the adoption, particularly by the anti-racist movement left, of a pro-immigrant, pro-diversity frame that focuses on the individual experiences of racism and differential treatment of Swedish people of color. I'm going to use that term, people of color, which we talked about this morning, in the Swedish case, which may sound odd, but that's my natural language, right? I want to consider kind of two high-profile instances of this kind of anti-racist talk that seem to have resonated very well with the Swedish public. A 2013 open letter by Jonas Cameri wrote an open letter to Beatrice Ask, the then Justice Minister, and a parliamentary speech. It was an acceptance speech for award by Yasun Timbuktu Diakité, who is a hip-hop artist. And they both kind of make very similar claims, and they both are instances in which this anti-racist talk goes viral, right? It becomes very important or very well read in Sweden. So Cameri's letter, which, as I said, was written to the then Justice Minister Beatrice Ask, and was published in Dagens Nyheter, and also, by the way, translated beautifully by Rachel Wilson Broyles. You can find it out there on the web. It was shared so many times in the next 24 hours after its publishment that theoretically, every Swede had seen it. Theoretically, right? It remains the most shared article of all time in the Swedish media. So it went viral in this huge, huge way. And what this letter does is it asks us to consider what it might be like to go through life in Sweden in darker skin. And this is and Cameri uses skin color here, which I think is important. He says, imagine if you were in my skin. And the picture that he paints is one of constant outsiderness. It's a kind of visceral individualist piece that puts personal experience itself at the center of one's conception of racism. Relating a story of when he was young and thrown into the back of a police vehicle without any explanation, Cameri writes, it's impossible to be part of the community when power always assumes you're another. Right? So Cameri is drawing on ideas of being a visible minority, right? He's not drawing on norms of or ideas about economic integration or cultural integration. Similarly, Yasun Timbuktu Diakité, who is the Swedish-born son of, I know you said all these authors, they always have their little bit, but I'm going to do it too, because it's important. He is the Swedish-born son of a white Swede mother and a black American civil rights lawyer father. And he also pointed to his state of not belonging. Diakité, in a dramatic gesture, pulls out his passport. He holds up his Swedish passport and explained to all gathered that this proves that he belonged, right? And he used to carry it everywhere because he belonged in Sweden. Now, an interesting kind of side story is that a couple months later, he went on Sveriges Radio. He did the summer prat thing. And he said, I accidentally brought my girlfriend's passport. So it wasn't actually his passport. but symbolic, the gesture is symbolic, right? It proves that I belong. But he said, despite the fact that I have this passport that proves that I belong, this didn't protect me. This didn't prevent the physical and verbal racism that I experienced constantly growing up in Sweden. The legal system didn't protect him from the personal experience of racism, and he goes on to make the point that neither did his experience of fame, right? He became quite famous, and it didn't protect him from racism either. Diakite's speech, an acceptance speech for a major award, also went viral, although not quite to the same extent as Kamiri's. In other words, both of these sets of stories hit home. And I think both of these examples are noteworthy because they don't argue that there's not space for people like them in the structure of Swedish society. Kamiri and Diakite are both wildly successful cultural producers who have traded on their unique experiences as insider-outsiders in Sweden, and have benefited from a Swedish system that supports the kind of art that they produce. No one's seeking their official exclusion, as in the case of newly arrived refugees. Rather, they argue that they're pushed out of the boundaries of belonging in a particular sphere, in their day-to-day lives. This is essentially an argument about bad people doing racist things, right, on the basis of appearance. While this is not the dominant, this sort of more personal discourse on racism is not the dominant discourse of any political party. There's been an upsurge in political talk around immigrants and minority Swedes itself about precisely racism, not xenophobia or ignorance, but racism as seen through the acts of racists and the experience of distinctly raced individuals. The adoption of a more individualist frame by the anti-racist left, and again I'm speaking mostly of the movement left, not the established left, looks, I think, similar to the rise of identity politics in the United States. The context and meaning of individualist anti-racism in Sweden is, I think, differently nuanced. It is a pushback against official colorblindness, first and foremost. Sweden has long been characterized by, as you've heard over and over, a constrained official discourse and media discourse on immigration that admitted neither, and this is important, neither anti-immigrant sentiment nor race or ethnicity conscious discourse. Indeed, the taboo against mentioning ethnicity or race in a Swedish context has been considerably stronger on the Swedish left than on the American left, despite, I think, evidence that race certainly plays a role in the experience of immigrants in their day-to-day life. It's both the prior silence and the present increase of intention that creates space for a far-right resurgence. Note that this is not to argue that mentioning race in the Swedish context has created the Sweden Democrats. It's not like the left said, hey, race, and then all of a sudden the Sweden Democrats appeared. People make that argument sometimes. That's not the kind of argument that I'm making. On the contrary, it's the attempt to renegotiate national boundaries based on cultural individualism instead that I think created that space. Neither Kamiri nor Diakite were arguing for group rights, nor were they arguing against controls on immigration. For most of Swedish history, boundaries of belonging were centered on social democracy with an undercurrent of statist but not cultural individualism. To be Swedish was to be left alone, perhaps in your little red cottage in the woods, supported by and supporting the state. To belong in the Swedish nation now, according to the anti-racist left, is to participate in a society that is at least tolerant of tolerance, right? That looks a little bit more like multiculturalism. SD voters, young, less educated, low income, and unemployed, by and large find themselves not only on the outside of the new boundaries, but framed as a threat to these boundaries, right? The irony, of course, is that SD and their supporters see Muslim refugees as the threat to Sweden, both quite literally in terms of terrorism and crime, and figuratively in terms of Swedish culture. Like poor white Trump voters, these SD voters find themselves unsupported by the system and perhaps unmoored from traditional political distinctions. Where they differ is that this system was built up and then dismantled by a small s social democracy, they still largely believe in, right? Here is where we can see the effect of the abandonment of strong social democracy by the social democrats. Previously, the social democratic welfare state had acted as a kind of engine of incorporation for both migrants and for potentially marginalized working class native Swedes. When the social democrats took their neoliberal turn in the 1990s, that engine for incorporation stalled for both of these groups, and the latter began to understand migrants, particularly the new Muslim non-white asylum seekers, as threats to the viability of that particular mode of incorporation. The response was to attack immigration as unsustainable, and the Sweden Democrats provided a vehicle for that kind of attack. Thus, the Sweden Democrats fulfill two vital needs for this set of voters. First, a need to see their views about the worth, and indeed possibly superiority, of the traditional white Swedish culture vindicated. And second, a need to see what the remaining economic prosperity of the welfare state protected from a group they view as unworthy and perhaps incapable of incorporation both economically and culturally. So to kind of conclude, I want to talk about what I want to say the twin perils of individualism and colorblindness. And I would argue that it's no inexplicable accident that Donald Trump mentioned Sweden as a site of a non-existent terrorist attack, responding as he was to this Fox News story, which I think heavily criticized by the people who appear in it, right, about a immigrant crime epidemic in the country that's largely exaggerated. Sweden has a place in the imaginary of the kind of international far right as a place that's been ruined by immigration. Sweden represents a cautionary tale for the American right and for the far right of some parts of continental Europe as well, a place of fictitious no-go zones and the supposed rape capital of the world, right? This is not true, you know. It's of course worthwhile to point out that the site of inclusion, which working class whites in the US and working class whites in Sweden imagine are, as a matter of fact, quite different. You know, in the US, it's a white working class that works hard without government interference or assistance, whereas in Sweden, it's a place where, you know, the welfare state still exists, and the trust that underlies it is still intact. But in both cases, immigrants and non-whites become the scapegoat for a lost paradise. The comparison of these two cases indicates that I think we ought to be suspicious of overly simple descriptions of either left or right voters. It's not merely the fact that the Democrats have for years ignored the so-called economic anxiety of rural white voters in the United States, nor the underrepresented social and economic unrest of young white unemployed men in Sweden that created a soil fertile for a very virulently racist far right in both of these places. It was also not only backlash against anti-racism or so-called identity politics in either place that sent a wave of racists into the halls of governance. Rather, it's the way that these things have coexisted in both places that creates a political landscape in which far-right racism becomes legitimized and indeed popular. More importantly, there's nothing wrong with calls for cultural inclusion that sometimes get labeled as identity politics, but calls for inclusion like this that start and end with identity without proffering a critique of the structural conditions that underlie systems of inequality and on which people of color, migrants old and new, and whites find themselves equally stumbling. It should be possible to combine honest and critical conversations on race with honest and critical conversations on economic inequality that includes all of these groups. That's it.
I'll speak into this one, if that's okay.
That's the recording one. It's not mine.
Oh, okay. So I'll take that in that case.
Oh, sorry. Logistic problems. Technical difficulties.
Thank you, Carly for a wonderfully rich paper, and provocative and very well informed and nuanced. I'm struck as I listened to this, and also had the privilege of reading an earlier draft of this, just how much you are indeed trafficking in a nuanced account, both of the left and of the right in Sweden, and also being sensitive to the boundaries between the two. My comments are somewhat of a potpourri in responses to this paper, followed at the end with a new topic I'd love to hear you consider. I think that one of the key distinctions that Carly offers to us is to look at the different ways that the quote-unquote establishment left versus the movement left within Sweden might be thinking and acting differently, and not to look past the possibility that unofficial, again, political actors might be having a foundational and transformative impact on the way that Swedish society is taking shape. One thinks, for example, about this distinction between individual versus group mobilization and recognition in battles over resource exposure and so on. Of course, in Sweden, officially, the left has embraced, I think, a type of constitutional multiculturalism that has a relatively little parallel outside of the Swedish state in 2002. And of course, a new statement was added to Sweden's constitution, saying that ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities' ability to preserve and develop their own culture and social life should be promoted. A sort of group-based possibility, at least allowance for minorities to, with state support in this case, be supported. And in 2010, that phrase was changed only with the word should, changed to shall. Who were the actors who did that? Well, it was the Green Party, Peter Eriksson, at that time. So there they are pushing a group-based mobilization of minority difference and recognition. Intolerance might be another code word put on top of that. At the same time, the racial individualism that you speak of, which I come to think about the term rasifiering, being racialized, being raced, that is indeed conceptualized and thought on individual bases. That has been pushed by the movement left, and certainly your account here urges us to take seriously the impact that could have. I'm also compelled by this concept, the crises of closure, which is one that you featured in your recent work, and it's a concept that you developed with its roots in Vander's thinking. In your written document, you talked about crises of closure relating to entry, in terms of border, who are we going to let into the physical space. You also talk about a crisis of closure relating to access to goods, and this is going to be in the context of a welfare state. It strikes me also that your work speaks to a third form of this crisis of culture, namely one of cultural identity, who is not only going to be let into the country, who will be granted access to goods and collected wealth and tax funds, but also who will be informally, culturally, socially, in that nebulous realm of human interaction, who will be counted as one of us. In order, cannot crisis of closure express themselves in those terms as well. I think also about this recognition of group difference and the place of whites within it. It has been one of the insights of multiculturalism scholars. I'm thinking first and foremost of Taylor in this instance, that part of the claims for oppression that underlie the birth of multiculturalism and the demand for a politics of recognition have to do with the stance that non- or misrecognition is grounds for claiming oppression. And that's an idea that in Taylor's instance, it emerges out of a history, a combination of demands for equality, also with a parallel understanding that being authentic to one's own identity is necessary and good in the modern world. But to the extent that basic idea has been articulated in actual politics, some commentators, some critics have thought that multiculturalism was really directed, the politics of recognition was directed to minorities exclusively, and not those who would be recognized as part of a majority. The battle for recognition could be, in some sense, a token of their exclusion from actual political power. Whereas those in a majority culture, whites in the West, were not really subject to this politics of recognition. However, if that's the case, the other insights of whiteness scholars, that one of the defining features of white identity is its unmarkedness. As Richard Dyer once said, other people, speaking from a white perspective, other people have race, we're just people. That means, if one understands oneself as normative and unmarked, that the claim of oppression via the logic of multiculturalism is always available, if one wishes to take it. One also wonders, in the case of Sweden, if these rural whites are being impacted in some way by collective identity politics or recognition of identity. What is going on then? How are they, in fact, coming to a place where they feel that the politics of recognition comment on them or in some way impact them? Even though you were, I think, are right to put that in, say that that's one potential feature among others. Finally, and here's a question and a thought about changing this. One of the more, I think, influential statements that came recently, and that takes up your very admirable cause of wanting to look at the ways that the left and the right might be interacting with each other, comes from two scholars, Tobias Hübinette and Katrin Lundström from Sweden, and they write about a white melancholia and a white nostalgia. Argue that a new nostalgia has taken root in Sweden, one that encompasses the far right and the far left. They note the fact that the far right in Sweden looks back at an old Sweden where things were homogenous and things were safe and secure, intelligible, where a chaos of modernity hadn't really taken hold to the same extent, and they long back to that period. Because of their rise, the left also looks back to a Sweden, an older Sweden with nostalgia, a time when Sweden might be able to claim to have been exceptionally anti-racist in ways that it no longer can today. And so I wanted to take, at the end of this rather long comment, to ask you to think about that, the role perhaps of nostalgia in bridging this gap, or at least bringing these two actors together. And thank you again for a wonderful paper.
Do you want me to respond, or should I respond? Or should I open up the floor? Okay. There's a lot in that comment. I'm going to respond to the pieces that I like, right? I think that I will need to read that piece on nostalgia, because it's certainly been something that's been talked about in the American context recently, right? And there's a whole lot of sociology and anthropology of the white working class that's come out that's all about racial nostalgia, right? And so I think it would be interesting to look at that in the Swedish case and see what kinds of parallels there are. It's interesting that you bring up a nostalgia for a time when Sweden was uniquely anti-racist, right? And that adds almost another kind of complicating wrinkle. You can't tell a neat story about that, right? A neat comparative story about that. But that makes it all the more interesting, right? What does that kind of nostalgia mean? And is it an accurate representation? Because most nostalgias are not accurate representations, right? And it seems to me that that's not a particularly accurate representation either. So I really appreciate that. I think that, and thank you for that. There was so much I can't remember all the pieces of it. But we'll talk more later. I think I'll open up to more questions of that.
And do you want to run the questions yourself, or would you like me to keep order?
Yeah.
Oh, you should keep the mic.
Yeah, there's a mic here. All right, you run.
Why don't we start with Edith and then we'll...
Yeah, I think Edith was first, but Shall I just pause? Yeah. No, thanks a lot. I mean, to both of you, but primarily to Carly. This was great, and I think it's extremely constructive and useful to do exactly what you're doing, to analyze the left in relation to what's going on the right side. And I think you're doing an excellent job. But there is one thing that I seen from looking at Sweden from the Norwegian side.
Yeah.
There are some things that I don't grasp really
Yeah.
in what you're saying. And that's this individualization thing.
Yeah.
That's one factor, and the other is this constrained public discourse on race.
Yeah.
Because seen with Norwegian eyes, I mean, Swedes talk about race all the time. I mean, in Norway, the public is much more reluctant to use the race word.
Yeah.
Whereas in Sweden, as we see it, they talk about race everywhere, and particularly, of course, in the version of pointing to racist talk and
Yeah.
racist groups and persons, etc.
Yeah.
And they have this Swedish term also, racialiserad,
Yeah.
which is also everywhere. I
Right,
mean,
which is an import from America.
Yes,
Yeah.
racialiserad. I do think that, I mean, and also, I mean, again, this individual thing. To me, I mean, in Sweden, they have been extremely focused on this structural racism kind of thing,
absolutely.
which is definitely not an individualistic thing. Whereas in Norway, we haven't, at least in the authorities,
Right.
have not at all talked about structural racism. It's not
Yeah.
a term that is used at all. And this is therefore it's puzzling for me that you are focusing so much on the individual.
I think it's absolutely true that traditionally the left, and this is actually the point that I'm trying to make here, is that traditionally the left has been focused on structural racism, that and I would argue to the exclusion of individual notions of race, and in that way is kind of the opposite of the United States, right? But as the language of race has been introduced in Sweden, which is relatively recent, that's brought with it these American notions of individual racism and individualized race. So it's kind of a matter of change. I think what you're seeing, the use of race that you're seeing is in Sweden is relatively new, and it's a conversation. The use of terms like racialiser and such are mostly scholarly and not popular discourses. Is my sense of it, and I could be wrong. I'm willing to adjust a little, but my sense in talking to Swedes and in reading newspapers and that kind of thing is that there's a very strong taboo around talking about differences as race differences as opposed to something else, and I do think it's certainly stronger than it is in the United States. But it may be weaker than it is in Norway, right? And so there's another kind of a point of reference. But I think it's the I wouldn't say abandonment, but the partial replacement of structural understandings of race with individual understandings of race in recent years that I'm trying to grapple with here. And again, in the movement left, right? Not so much in the establishment left, which I think is still quite focused on structural issues. To their credit, as you point out.
Yeah, let me turn a little from the race ethnic issue to the more policy oriented. You did make some comments and observations about the sort of the political left in various countries turning towards neoliberalism.
Yeah.
I think that's accurate. But it's also useful to remember some of the reasons why. And one of them is that it kept losing elections on their more traditional program. If we think about the United States, you have the Democrats winning in 1976 on a already more conservative platform, and then not again until 1992 with Bill Clinton and the three-way race that made it possible. And then in 1994, you have Gingrich's takeover of Congress. So Clinton doesn't have really a chance to put in anything other than something that he can sell broadly. In Britain, it's even more dramatic with the conservative Thatcher era from 1979 until Tony Blair puts together another formula in 1997. Sweden, in many ways, is still remarkably traditional in its politics. If you even look at Norway and Denmark, the social democratic hegemony period ends pretty much in the 1960s. Sweden, it's true that the Social Democrats lose an election in 1976 in Sweden, after, what, 40 years, almost 40 years approximately.
Yeah.
But that's really remarkable, and you really still have social democratic hegemony in Sweden for another decade or
Yeah.
so. And one of the reasons why the Social Democrats moved to the right, if you will, on policy issues is there too. They failed to have, the economic democracy issue doesn't get the mileage they had hoped. So in other words, one of the problems in the democratic countries is you have to win elections
Right.
to govern. And
Well, I mean, I think it's important. The neoliberal turn in social democracy in Sweden actually precedes their electoral losses. I mean, the writing's on the wall, but they do it before they lose in the 90s. In terms of abandonment of full employment and things like that, and so there are other forces pushing. So it's strategic and necessary too. I would never argue that the neoliberal turn wasn't a response to failures, failures on the part of the left. But just because they're necessary doesn't mean they don't have these long-term negative effects for the left, right? In terms of winning. They give away, in the United States is a great example, they give away the left and they never are able to regain it, right? We still haven't regained the left that was given away in the 1990s, and I think that's true in Sweden too.
well, and then also Sweden, of course, has an economic crisis in 1991,
Right.
92,
Yeah.
which is really one of the most severe ones
Yeah.
since the 1930s, in many ways even worse. So
Yeah.
they are scrounging around for policies that will keep Sweden afloat.
Yeah.
Now, this just happens to, I think this is kind of independent of the migration issue. It's not a cause and effect.
It happens at the same time, right? So they're independent, but they become linked in people's understandings.
Right. And then they have something to do with the rise of the New Democracy Party that Ben mentions. It's not exactly analogous to what we have today, but it was a reaction against the tax and financial crisis of the era. So events cause elections.
Let's see, I think Kevin, you want to... Yes.
Hi, so thank you for a very interesting and thought-provoking talk. I was interested when you brought up this concept, this sort of new trend, trying to renegotiate belonging, especially in terms of this very problematic colorblindness in Sweden. I wonder how you see that. I don't know if you've come across any discourses on how that relates to this sort of 2001 parliamentary decision to remove the word race from all Swedish legislation, which I understand is still happening today. How do you see
I mean,
that?
I think it's part and parcel of the same thing. I mean, I think it, I have to I would like to kind of look in depth around the discourse around it, but my reading of it is that it's the same kind of argumentation where if we stop talking about racial problems will go away. We see that over and over again in the United States. In both legislative and popular contexts. I think those ideas are also quite important in Sweden, that if race is not written in to the legal code, then the mechanisms that produce economic leveling will also produce racial leveling. It doesn't work like that though, right? I mean, those aren't the actual outcomes, but I think that's the thinking behind it. But that's a great other parallel that maybe we should bring in.
Whichever one of you had your hands up first. Yes.
I guess I did. So let me just say that I would like to thank all the speakers for some really thought-provoking and intriguing papers and ideas, so thought-provoking and intriguing, in fact, that I find myself nostalgic for the 1950s. For this reason, that, as I think Eric and others mentioned yesterday, we had a refugee crisis after World War II. And it was not solved in several years, it was solved in a decade and a half, if indeed we can consider it solved. I remember in 1955 and in 1957, so-called displaced persons, refugee families coming to my small town in western Pennsylvania. This was part of a an international effort to bring people out of the former war zone into places where they could begin a new life. This took the United Nations, this took the United States, this took those countries in Europe that weren't too badly damaged during the war. It was an international effort on the part of everyone involved. And frankly, the difference that I see in the climate today is that nobody wants to take charge. Nobody wants to do this. Sweden can't do it on its own. Germany can't do it on its own. The United States, the United Nations, the EU need to step in. I'm not reassured that that will happen.
Yeah. I agree. I don't have much else to say about this, but all of these issues are better solved at an international level than they are at a national level. I think that's true.
I might need the microphone to be heard. I don't know.
You might have to come down.
Drawing on a couple of the lectures from the last 2 days, it was mentioned a couple times that Sweden feels that social democratic welfare state that they have is like a great national achievement, and they feel patriotic towards it. And that welfare state model obviously relied on full or near full employment to avoid having a reserve army and unemployed. And it was mentioned that welfare state chauvinism towards migrants having a hard time in the labor force is common in the rhetoric. And is there? There's a.
Why, come down to the.
So can everyone hear me now? Okay. So just to reiterate, it was said in a few talks that Sweden has a nationalistic sentiment or patriotic sentiment towards their social democratic welfare state, which relies on full or near full employment to sustain itself and avoid having a reserve army of unemployed. And the migrants are having a harder time entering the labor force, which is inspiring sort of welfare state chauvinism, where people perceive them as being damaging to the structure of that. So is the peculiarly nationalistic feeling towards a more left-wing political economy something that's leaving room for more right-wing populist discourse?
That's a good question. I think yes is the short answer. The long answer is that I think this national identity attached to the welfare state and attached to social democracy is not quite as hegemonic as it used to be. And so there's room for kind of multiple interpretations of it. But I definitely think, the social democrats have also in their history been welfare chauvinists, right? In the 60s, Olaf Palme goes around, who is the great internationalist, he goes around saying we need to be really careful not to let in too many migrants because they'll destroy the equality that we have, right? So it's not a uniquely right thing in Sweden, and it hasn't been. But I definitely think the idea that nationalism might be tied to the welfare state is part of Estes and other parts, kind of anti-immigrant sentiment. So I think that's an astute connection. I can't say much about Norway or Denmark, but maybe somebody else can, since it's a good question for everybody, really.
Was there a hand?
Let me just remind people that this is the point that Greta made yesterday, and in her writings even more, that the Scandinavian welfare state works because it's bounded, because of a specific territory. And there are efforts in Europe to try to set minimum standards in social welfare, and there's reciprocity, there are all kinds of things. But it really only works if people, pay as they go and pay as they demand these services. And of course, any new group that comes in large numbers is going to, at least for a while, upset the apple cart. Now, ideally, it will provide the human capital for the future, which again is you need actually bodies to do the work in a welfare state. It's not just passing around checks and money. But as Greta's work shows, the welfare state in part is an economic formula that only works when you have a relatively closed system. And your book discusses that there's also a kind of ideology, historical aspect, and national aspect to it as well, that creates this solidarity to overcome the class historic differences within the country.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think as Greta points out, if you want the new migrants to contribute to the solidarity rather than destroy it, right? You need to get them into work as fast as possible, right? That's the solution. That's the solution that would least upset our ongoing order, right?
Are you able to speak louder?
Yeah, I can do that. This is a very short question. I was just wondering, from the U.S. perspective about immigration, about where do all these workers go and taking our jobs and that kind of rhetoric, right, that you hear here in the U.S. I've been hearing so much recently in the news, primarily radio news, about automation and about the fact that there are no jobs to take.
Yeah.
Right, the jobs belong to robots now. And I was just thinking about this in terms of like the origin, right, like this historical idea about Scandinavian welfare states and the time in which they came about. That was certainly not the case in a far-off dream in anybody's eye, of reaching an age in which you don't really need human labor in large numbers. But we're kind of getting there now. And I was wondering if that's something, because so many of you are much more well-read in all of the various Scandinavian countries, that's being talked about, like, or is it just something that people are not saying, like, why don't we need these people as unskilled workers?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're absolutely right to point out that there's job loss is not, there's job loss going on in all these places, right? The low-wage jobs are disappearing, and the ones, in the United States, we have a problem. Not only are low-wage jobs disappearing, but the ones that remain get worse and worse, right? So, our wages have been stagnant. They're disappearing in the Scandinavian countries as well, and they're getting a little bit worse, but not to the extent of the United States, right? We've got more part-time work and contingent work and stuff like this in all these places. As to whether, that's a really good question. Maybe somebody else can answer it besides me, but as to whether this discourse on automation coming in and taking all the jobs anyway, right, is also present in the Scandinavian countries. I don't know. I haven't seen it, but that doesn't mean it's not there, and maybe somebody else can answer.
I said I haven't seen it either, but it doesn't mean it's not there. No, it's there.
It is there. Yeah.
But researchers don't agree
Yep.
when it comes to the effect on which groups in the labor market.
And if we're really honest, everybody thought robots and automation were going to destroy all the jobs in the 60s and 70s too, right? And what happens is the low wage jobs disappear and you get tech jobs instead, right? They're replaced with a different kind of job. But then the question then is what happens to all these low skilled people? And one choice is to invest in education, right? And make sure that people have job skills. But there's always going to be a group that isn't able to or doesn't acquire those jobs. And so this is where the question of who does this hit hardest, right? But this is a somewhat new conversation, but it's also a conversation that we've been having for 50 years. The assembly line, right, was going to put people out of jobs.
Well, I think it's the same evolution. I think it's coming up now on the radio because Trump is claiming to be creating jobs, and then he's going to be able to create jobs, and that's just a reality check. But those weren't unskilled or badly paid jobs either. Yeah,
they became that way over time, right? So the jobs that are poorly paid now once weren't. So manufacturing jobs don't pay nearly as well as they did 30 years ago, right? And that's a really important point.
Well, I left this literature kind of in the early 2000s, but the labor movement, declined here in the U.S.
It declines everywhere in the world.
Yes, but I think again, those were better paid and entree points for people in the middle class.
Yep.
Or were these very sort of factory jobs with great benefits, and it was the gateway of working class people into middle class living. That has declined significantly as the labor movements across various stages of work in the United States have declined even further. I don't know if that trend is, again, when I left this literature was the early 2000s. In Scandinavia, the union rate was like 90% at that time, and those jobs, it was different. I don't know if they're apples.
It's falling in Scandinavia too, and if we look at the growth of inequality, and we compare countries, not on absolute levels of inequality, but growth of inequality, the Scandinavian countries show some of the highest rates of growth of inequality. They still remain highly equal, but the change of the pace of change is quite fast. And the same thing is happening, and I think it was delayed, but union rates are falling across the world.
Yes.
So I wanted to pick up on something you said about the difference between the Swedish Democrats and the Republicans, in that there were a large number of Trump voters who had fairly high incomes and were not necessarily the sort of people losing jobs to automation or immigration. And structurally, one of the biggest differences between Swedish politics and American politics is that what Americans would call parties, other countries would call coalitions, which are made up of multiple parties. And we, as a result of that distinction, I wonder if you see more of a sort of lack of partitioning between different reasons why you would vote a particular way in American far-right politics versus Swedish far-right politics, where that sort of populist nationalist movement can get partitioned into the Swedish Democrats. And I guess the operational question is, what effect does the Swedish Democrats have on the not quite Swedish Democrat conservatives?
Well, I think we also really need to be careful about attributing to the mainstream right in Sweden anti-immigrant sentiment. I mean, some of the very strongest sort of support for refugees has come from the Swedish right. So that's just kind of a precursor. But you're absolutely right. So a vote for Trump is not a clear signifier of anti-immigrant sentiment or of racism necessarily. And some will argue it's a signifier that you tolerate racism, but it's not a signifier that that's the reason you're voting. We don't have a vote for Trump is less of a clear signal than a vote for the Sweden Democrats about what you believe in, and we can see that in the profile of voters. And as I was saying in the break to Nicole, right, what happens is that the Republicans, for the most part, did not lose their voters, right? So they didn't, despite the fact that Trump is this far right guy, right? He doesn't lose rich white guys either. He doesn't lose rich white women either, which is kind of appalling. But it was a surprise to the Democrats, I think, and we can kind of explain that as by polarization in the Swedish and in the American context, right? The idea that Hillary Clinton is a reviled figure, right? And so anybody's better than Hillary, right? But you're right, in the Swedish case, a vote for the Sweden Democrats, there are alternatives for conservative voters. There are multiple alternatives for relatively conservative voters who are not anti-immigrant. And so that vote, the signal is not the same. It makes it harder to analyze American politics in some ways.
We have time for one last.
Yeah, so in the post-Trump era in the US, there's been kind of a preoccupation with outer.
Sorry, can you come down and
Yeah. So in the post-Trump era in the US, there's been kind of a preoccupation with this question of how do we reincorporate liberal power into the Democratic left.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, what about instead if the Democratic left acknowledged the sort of structural racism and then kind of tried to forge real political coalition with some of the groups that are affected by that? Do you see that as a politically viable strategy in the US and Sweden?
That's an option, and one of the features of this this recent election is that, Barack Obama had African American voters turn out at high rates and Hillary Clinton did not, right? And so one option, if the Democrats want to win the next election, right, is to address structural racism, right? To listen to Black Lives Matter, right? To listen to the movement to the left, right? And also incorporate Bernie voters, right? Who are not the same people either, right? There's marginalization over there too, right? Not all marginalized whites end up in the Republican Party. Some of them end up disaffected, right? But if you do that, then you risk basically permanently alienating poor whites. And maybe that's a good trade-off. I mean, I don't know, it depends on your political persuasion, but maybe that's an okay trade-off. But you're not going to win back rural whites by addressing structural racism. And I also have to point out, because I said this quickly, rural whites have been voting for Republicans for a long time, right? That's not what's new about Donald Trump. It's the Rust Belt urban whites that are new, and the loss of those. And if the Democrats need to work to gain back that population. I think the rural white vote is lost for a long time. I don't think it's worth the political capital to go after that vote for them. But that's political strategy.
With that, please join me in giving Carly another round of applause for what
I'm gonna use them. Okay.
Oh. Do whatever you need to do.
Is this on? Is it on? No? Okay, do you hear me? Yes. So Eric, now I understand what you were saying yesterday about being the only one standing between the weekend. And now I am that person. So I was asked to make a few concluding remarks, and I will try my very best to just shortly summarize, hopefully not oversimplifying too much, and reflect on the topics that have been discussed here yesterday and today by our distinguished experts in dialogue with a very engaged audience. Thank you all so much for making this happen, especially all the students who have been contributing to the discussion in a great way. I'm going to keep this very brief. So we have approached the topic of managing multicultural Scandinavia from a wide range of perspectives. And I think it is safe to say now at the end of the symposium how important such an interdisciplinary approach and conversation is in order to gain a deeper understanding of the present discourses around immigration, multiculturalism, integration, statelessness, etc. in Scandinavia today. So yesterday, Eric pointed to the fact that while the recent 50 years of immigration to the Scandinavian countries are unprecedented in terms of scale, earlier historical periods of migration and minority-majority relations can offer important insights into how societies have dealt with differences in the past. The definitions of Swedes, Danes, Norwegians, Finns have evolved in history and will continue to do so. It was only as the ideology of nationalism grew that people would question on a wider scale the presence of national outsiders. Today's discourses on immigration in Scandinavia have a dominant quantitative element to it in terms of sheer numbers. And the present political struggle on part of the political establishments in Scandinavia is often described as finding a balance between what is called humanitarianism on the one side and realism on the other side. And one obvious challenge that remains is to how to integrate large numbers of immigrants into members of the Scandinavian societies. Now, how is this integration to be carried into effect, and where do things stand today? Not least for those individuals who have fled the wars in Syria, the violence and persecution in Iraq and Afghanistan, to just name the most common ones, in search for a better life. As Nicole demonstrated in her paper, The Nordic countries have replaced, to various degrees, earlier humanitarian responses with securitization measures in the name of national security and border control. And because of this, the movement of refugees has been greatly restricted, and the path to citizenship seems longer than before. Nicole also predicted that the number of undocumented immigrants and stateless individuals would rise because of this, a trend that the EU, after Brexit, seems less and less likely to be able to restrain. But Nicole also stressed that state actors can choose to take the position that these groups pose real or perceived threats to the dominant culture, or to view the refugee, the immigrant, the denizen as a potential citizen and as a resource. The arrival of large numbers of international migrants challenge long-held notions of citizenship in the Nordic countries that traditionally has been coupled with white ethnicity and Nordic language. So in order to naturalize immigrants as citizens, we also need to rethink, reconfigure earlier notions of citizenship. Echoing the need of exploring new notions of citizenship and national belonging in the Nordic countries, Peter demonstrated how contemporary Swedish literature functions as a domain for what he called a post-ethnic Swedish imaginary. A number of contemporary writers in Sweden illuminate in their literary works the tacit, linguistic, cultural, and racial boundaries that still inform notions of national identity, often also engaging in questions regarding race, a subject that is still regarded as problematic, if not taboo, in officially colorblind Sweden. Reddy, on her part, in her keynote speech, presented how the welfare state seems to be both part of the problem as well as the solution to the present systemic challenge to the Nordic welfare model. A broad investment in people is still one of the essential instruments in order to rescue the future of the Nordic model. But in order to maintain a productive balance between an orderly labor market and a redistributive welfare state without a disproportionate amount of welfare resources being consumed by newcomers, and thus risking the legitimacy of the system because majority populations feel overtaxed, some sort of contribution-based system with entrenchment at the margins and increased divisions between insiders and outsiders will probably be introduced in some form in the future, Greta predicts. The future of such measures, as well as other policies on immigration and integration to Scandinavia, lie in the hands of the political establishments in the Nordic countries, establishments who are trying to understand and position themselves vis-a-vis the success of anti-immigrant populist parties and movements. And Carly, in her paper, argued that the rise of the Sweden Democrats in Sweden and their role as disruptor of Swedish politics as usual was caused because of the established red-green bloc, together with an anti-racist movement of the left, having abandoned a prior focus on structural and political incorporation, and instead focused on an individualist conception of anti-racism. Historically, as she also has demonstrated in her recent book on immigration and social democracy in Sweden in the 20th century, the social democratic welfare state has functioned as an engine to incorporate migrants as well as working-class native Swedes. But these mechanisms have stalled with a so-called neoliberal turn in politics since the 1990s. But rather than blaming identity politics, the rise of the Sweden Democrats, or for that matter, the election of Donald Trump in the US, it should be possible, Carly pointed out, to have a critical and honest conversation on race, as well as an honest and critical conversation on economic inequality that also includes poor whites. In order to further understand the continued support of the Sweden Democrats, we also need to study the unfolding and dynamic transatlantic interaction taking place between Trump, the so-called alt-right movement in the US, and the Sweden Democrats, as Ben demonstrated in his paper. The Sweden Democrats have been, as we heard, highly ambivalent to Trump, since the associations between him and the Sweden Democrats risk the trust of Swedish voters. But it has also generated a discussion among party members to reassert their identity and to provide a new set of associations in order to emphasize their particular political project, to rebrand themselves. So, as you can see, all of these issues are interrelated and need careful scrutiny from different scholarly perspectives, and I think this symposium has really testified to the power of an interdisciplinary approach to this theme of managing multicultural Scandinavia. I want to say one last very important thing. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the hard and passionate work of Cheryl Harbison, and I think you should join me in applauding her for making this happen. Thank you very much. That was it. You want to say something, Sharon?
I haven't prepared anything, but I just want to say thank you. Thank you for everybody who came and what you said already, everybody who participated, everyone who will go away with new ideas and chew on this material. It's been wonderful to see so many ranges of people and get so much participation. Thank you. Thank you. It was worth the work.